Two major events converged in my life in October of 2018. The first was that I was invited to perform and was going to perform for the first time at the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. The second was that week leading up to the National Storytelling Festival was the week of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing. And now, I never knew Brett Kavanaugh, but I gotta say, I still took that week very personally. When I was in my 20s, I was raped, and I didn't tell anyone about it, and I didn't talk about it for years. And so I believe the women. On top of that, though, I had been feeling this building pressure of anger and frustration over the years, this pressure that was just building up against them. You know, them, the mostly older, mostly white men who are in control of so much in this country. And as that week wore on, my anger built, and I was getting frustrated over every wrong I've ever had to endure simply for not having a penis. You know, I mean, from sexual harassment and sexual assault to not getting certain jobs that I know I would have gotten had I been equipped properly, to little things that might seem little but that build up over time, like all the freaking mansplaining. At the time I was invited to perform at the National Storytelling Festival, I had been a storyteller for 12 years. I'd been teaching storytelling workshops for 7 years, and yet when I taught the last workshop before the festival, there was a man, and yes, he was older, and yes, he was white, who held up his hand. And when I called on him, he proceeded to re-explain the exact same thing I had just explained, and I'd like to say quite aptly, but he felt like he had to clear things up for the entire class. And I gotta say, he did it over and over and over during that class, and that was not the first time that's happened, and that was not the last time that happened. And leading up to the biggest performance of my life, all of these thoughts and anger and frustration was just building up, and I realized if I was gonna go and perform in front of 1,500 people and connect with the audience, then I was gonna have to figure out a way to stop being so angry, because that's not a great place to be when you're trying to communicate with people, right? So I stopped watching the news, and I took Brett Kavanaugh and I put him in a little box at the back of my brain, and I took all those years of frustration and I locked them away, and I focused on performing. At the end of that week, I took my husband and my 2 kids, and we got in the car and we drove down to Tennessee, and we arrived the night before my performance at the Storyteller Hotel. It's not actually called that, but when you're a performer in the festival, they put you up in a hotel with all of the other storytellers from the festival. So I walk into the hotel, and there are all these famous, like nationally and internationally renowned storytellers that some of you might have heard of. And yes, the lobby is filled with mostly men, mostly older, mostly white, but I was just so excited to be in the room, like in their presence, and all I had to do to be allowed to stay there was kill it the next night for my performance. So the next night, I stepped out onto stage in a tent in front of 1,500 people, and I started to tell my story. Now, it's a story I've told a million times before, and I practiced about 1 billion more times, and it's a mostly funny story. It's an entertaining story about me when I was young, learning to scuba dive to please the man I was with, and I am pretty much the last person in the world who should try scuba diving, but I did it anyway. And it's a funny story, but the subtext of that story is that so many women, they put their partner's happiness before their own, right? So I wanted to make people laugh, but I wanted the women to get me. And I gotta tell you, I nailed it. I mean, I'm not bragging to say this.
Yes, you did. I was there.
Thank you. But I had the audience, including Sufyan, just eating out of my hand. And it was a wonderful feeling. It was amazing. I felt so great after that performance that I just sort of floated off the stage, you know? And at the end of there were 6 of us on stage that night, at the end of the show, when they released everyone, I couldn't get out of the tent because all of these people kept coming up to me and telling me how great I was, which is a really nice feeling. And a lot of people came up to me and said they enjoyed my story, but a lot of women came up to me and they said, thank you for sharing that. I think that's such an important message, and you need to reach more women with that story, and you need to especially reach young women with that story. And I knew I had done it. I had succeeded. I had made 1,500 people laugh, but I had also made 51% of the population learn something, you know? And I was so elated. I floated back to the Storyteller Hotel, and I didn't sleep at all that night because I was floating 6 feet above my bed. And the next morning, I got the kids to go down to the breakfast area to eat breakfast in the company of all these amazing storytellers that I knew I belonged with, right? And my husband stayed in the room to take a shower. So we go downstairs to get breakfast, and my kids run ahead of me into the breakfast room, and I start walking into the room, and I get stopped by Ed. Ed is a nationally renowned storyteller. He is white, he is a man, he is older, and he holds up his hand to me. And I stop, and he says, I have some notes for you on your story. And that bubble that I was floating around in all night, it just explodes, and I drop down to reality. And I understand, I'm not one of them. I didn't succeed. I'm not allowed in that room. But at that point, my kids started a food fight with the other storytellers, and well, Ed kind of looked behind him and saw what was going on and said, oh, maybe you should just deal with that first. And I had to bite my tongue, keep from saying, oh yeah, maybe that's all I'm good for. So instead I just said, yeah, I'm gonna go be a mom now to my kids. And I went in there and I got the kids seated at a table and I got them some food, and I just sat there feeling deflated. And after a few minutes of that, the room went silent. And if you have ever been in a room filled with storytellers, you will know that that is a rare occurrence. But all eyes went to the TV, and the news came on, and they announced Brett Kavanaugh had been confirmed. And I couldn't look at it, I couldn't see his face in that moment, so I turned away from the TV, and who should I lock eyes with but Ed? And he just went, I'm sorry. And I didn't want to see him feeling sorry. I was so angry. So I just looked down at my food and I started stabbing it like I had a knife, you know, and then my husband came down, and I know myself, when I'm living in anger, I can't let it go until I deal with the problem, if I'm able to deal with the problem. So I handed the kids off to my husband, and I went up to Ed and I said, let's have that talk. And he said, oh no, you can finish your breakfast. And I said, no, let's do it now. So we went and we found a sort of quiet table off to the side, and I kid you not, Ed pulled out a notebook and started flipping through pages of notes, forwards and backwards, and finally got to the first page. And I was just sitting there trying to sort of force a smile, gritting my teeth, hoping I didn't look psychotic, you know, because this was a man in power, and I couldn't let my true feelings show. So he said, well, first of all, your appearance. And I thought, oh no, do not go there. But he did. He said, well, your dress, the suit you were wearing, the nylons, the heels, it was all very professional. And you honored the audience with your appearance. And I thought, well, okay, that was kind of a nice thing to say, but he couldn't say anything bad about my appearance. You don't insult a lady's looks, right? So I just smiled and thanked him, and then he flipped to the next page. And he said, your performance. And I thought, I know, I'm Italian, I use my hands too much, just go ahead, let me have it. And he said, you know, your timing was great. You paused to let the laughter die down, you paused to let a message sink in, and you listened to the audience. You took their feedback. By the end, you had the audience eating out of your hand. And I thought, yeah. Okay, fine. And I smiled and I thanked him. And then he turned to the next page and he said, and your story. And my story was awesome, so he better not say anything bad about my story. And I just gritted my teeth a little bit more, and he said, you know, on one hand, this was a fun story. You're a funny storyteller. It was very entertaining. You had the audience laughing. But on a different level, this was a story about you surviving a mentally abusive relationship. And I just kind of sat back in my seat like, wait a minute. How did you know that? How did you know that? And then he continued and he said, you know, and the audience was so worried about you. We needed to know that you were okay. And at the end, when you said no and you walked out, we knew not only were you okay in that moment, but that you were okay now. And that is such an important message that you need to share with everybody. Young men and young women need to hear that they can survive getting out of a bad relationship. And then I just didn't know what to do because I kind of learned something, right? Like, that story wasn't just for the women in the audience, and it took this mostly older, mostly white guy to tell me that. So as I'm sitting there just kind of in shock, Ed closes up his notepad and he puts it away, and that snaps me out of it. And I lean forward and I go, well, what about the butt? And he says, what? And I say, you said you had notes for me. I'm waiting for what I did wrong. And he said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call it notes. I just wanted to give you some feedback. You were great. You're a great storyteller. And then he reached out his hand and shook mine and said, welcome to Jonesboro.
Wow.
And that, you know, that was a beautiful moment. Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court. I am still angry a lot of the time. But I am trying to survive this world we live in and not just be seething with anger at all times. And so I try to remember Ed, and to remember that sometimes when a man holds up his hand, even an older, even a white guy, when he holds up his hand to me, maybe, sometimes he is simply reaching out to say welcome.